We are continuing in Hilchos Basar B'chalav in Yoreh Deah Pei Zayin. We're going to be going through Sifim Beis, Gimel, and Daled. So we're in Yoreh Deah 87, 2, 3, and 4. And they are related more so than Sif Aleph because they are going to discuss the types of meat or milk upon which the prohibition of Basar B'chalav applies. We're going to look at a few different types of foods, and we're going to compare and contrast which types apply to the Torah's prohibition or to whom the prohibition is applied, and to which types the prohibition is not applied. We can also look at it the following way. Certain foods are included in the category of basar, certain foods are included in the category of chalav, and certain foods are excluded from both those categories. So what we're going to look at is which types of meat are in the category of meat, and then we're going to look at what is the rule regarding meat that is considered nevela or treifa, okay, meaning that it has come from an animal that has died improperly or that has died because of its wounds. And we're also going to look at fats from the animal that have been cooked in milk. And at that point, we're going to look at things that are prohibited, not because they are prohibited, but they are prohibited because they look like the prohibited mixtures, and those are in the sug of maras ayin. Okay, we're going to talk about our good friend, some people like to call him Morris ayin, and the idea is that it is a permitted thing for which we apply an isur because it looks like the prohibited thing, but not because it itself is prohibited. And there's a few things that will follow into that category, such as certain types of milks and things that we call milk, and also certain things that are excluded from the explanation of basar, like fish. And with milk, we're going to look at some of the interesting sources that come into that. So let's look at the halachos that we're going to discuss, and then jump in a little bit of the prohibition of the type of meat to which the prohibition applies. Okay, so talking about this, we have halacha beis first. So when we learned that we said lo tavashel gedi b'chalevi mo, the Shulchan Aruch quotes the following statement: gedi lav davka doesn't mean specifically a small goat. The huadin shor se ve'ez. This includes also other types of bovines, meaning cows and bulls. It refers to sheep and rams, and to goats, different types of goats. V'leishna b'chalev aim, leishna b'chalev acheres. And there's no distinction between the milk that comes from its own mother or the milk that comes from any other of these animals. Rather, the Torah was speaking about the way it was done in that time period. Halacha Gimel. So again, we are limiting the application of this prohibition to meat that is from an animal that is a permitted animal by Torah law. And the mixture has to be with an animal that produces milk, or the milk produced by an animal that is from one of the animals permitted by Torah law. But if there's a kosher animal whose meat is mixed in with the milk of a non-kosher animal, or you have the meat of a non-kosher animal mixed with the milk of a kosher animal, mutarim b'bishul uvahana. And the Shulchan Aruch is particular to say they are permitted for cooking and for benefit. Obviously not for eating because they are mixed with a non-kosher item. Ubasar chayav oif afilu b'chalav tahara mutar b'bishul uvahana. And we also now learn that the meat of the kosher wild animals and also the meat that is produced by birds of kosher animals even though they are mixed with kosher milk, they are considered permitted for cooking and for benefit. And even for consumption, their prohibition was only extended rabbinically. But the flesh of fish and that of the kosher locust are not prohibited even rabbinically to mix them with milk. The Rama adds, "V'nahogu la'asos chalav mishakadim." Now, it should be known that we do make milk from almonds, u'manichin ba basar oif, and we put chicken into that milk. Hoyel ve'eno rak med'rabanan. Behold, this is simply a rabbinic prohibition, meaning putting chicken into actual milk would only be rabbinic. Okay, so we're saying that we have a custom to do this anyway. Aval basar behema yesh lahaniach eitzel hachalav shekedim mishum maras ha'ayin. But for beef, for example, or mutton, right, from the meat from goats that are placed into almond milk, one should have almonds available next to it so that one can recognizably tell that the milk is from the almonds because of appearances, maras ha'ayin, what people might see. They might see that you're making basar b'chalav. Which was explained earlier in the Halacha chapter 66, regarding blood. Okay? And in that case, they're talking about if you're drinking the blood from fish, you should leave some scales in it. He doesn't say that. I'm just adding that in to explain what he's leaving out. And Halacha Daled, Asur levashel b'chalav isha mipnei maras ha'ayin. One may not use the milk that is produced by a human female because of maras ha'ayin, so we extend maras ha'ayin to that. And should it fall into your cooked food, it is considered nullified and does not have to be measured. So therefore, it's done by accident, that's okay, but to do it intentionally would not be permitted. The Rama adds, "V'nahagu lefize the kol shekain le'asor levashel lechachila b'chalav tmeya o basar tmeya b'chalav tahara." And based on this, I'm extending the prohibition to cook even before the fact, to allowing it at all to cook the non-kosher meat in the milk of a non-kosher animal, or the meat of a non-kosher animal in kosher milk. Okay, again, because of this maras ha'ayin extension. V'davka basar behema, and that's because it's from the meat of beef or mutton and so on. But I still consent that it's permitted, and or I contend that it's permitted to do it rabbinically for basar of its own rabbinically prohibited. So let's look at the different types of meat that are prohibited by basar b'chalav, because a lot goes on in there, and these things really connect each other because there is lots of permissions and lots of prohibitions. So let's look at where the prohibitions are. So let's start with the beginning of this whole thing. The Mishna says in Chulin, on 113a, that the meat, basar behema tahira b'chalav behema tahira asur levashel v'asur b'hana. Okay, so if you take kosher meat, kosher milk, you cook them together, boom. There's a prohibition to cook them and a prohibition to benefit from them. Now, if you take kosher meat and you take non-kosher milk, okay, and you take non-kosher meat, but take kosher milk, that is permitted to cook and permitted by benefit. Okay, so that's similar to what the Shulchan Aruch himself says. The Mishnah continues, quoting Rabbi Akiva, Chaya v'of einam min ha'Torah. So the Torah excludes wild animals like deer, for example, that are kosher, and birds that are kosher. They are not prohibited. Why? Because the Torah says, Lo tavashel gedi b'chalev imo, shalosh ba'amim. Because the Torah says, do not cook a calf in its mother's milk 3 times. What does that teach me, Rabbi Akiva says? Prat chaya, to exclude the wild animal, v'la'of, and for the birds, kosher birds, ubehema tmeya, and also animals themselves that are not kosher. Rabbi Yossi Glili Omer, Rabbi Yossi Glili adds another opinion. So it says you should not eat any nevela. Lo tochlu kol nevela. Okay? It says, so eat that. Do not eat that. And it also makes a statement not to eat a kid cooked in his mother's milk. Okay, so that which is prohibited because of nevela, okay, one cannot cook for basar b'chalav. Okay, so he's including that in that case. And birds, he says, that are usher because of nevela, that they should also be prohibited by basar b'chalav. Talmud lomar b'chalev imo. And so therefore, I'm going to exclude them for a different reason, because as chalev imo yatsa of she'in lo chalev aim, because a bird is not considered part of the class of animals that produce milk, and therefore they are excluded. Okay, so let's understand what the Mishna is talking about. So Rashi explains that Rabbi Kiva is excluding these three types of meat. It's excluding birds, wild animals, and non-kosher animals. Okay? So Rashi explains that the first word gedi excludes birds. Why? Not a domesticated animal, not a behema. Okay? Another gedi excludes the chaya. Okay? Again, not a behema. Why? So even though the chaya is similar to a behema, the extra statement of gedi comes to exclude another category, which would be in this case the chaya. Okay, and the third gedi comes to tell me that we are excluding non-kosher animals, but a kosher animal, which is not a goat, not a baby goat, right? Like a cow or a little lamb. Okay, those are included because we have another brayser that says that in another place. Okay, so we already learned that in the first halacha. We're not going to discuss it here. So, discussing Rabbi Yossi's opinion, Rashi says we say not to consume nevela. Okay, so Rashi explains in that verse itself, it says not to eat it, and then in the second verse it says not to cook it, and it's referring to a gedi. Okay, so it seems to imply that all those things that are included in the general prohibition of nevela is going to be included in the prohibition of basar b'chalav. So that's how Rashi explains the Mishnah. Now Tosfos adds something interesting. So he says the following. Okay, so basar oaf, according to the first opinion brought in the Mishnah, should have been prohibited by Torah law. And only Rabbi Kiva comes and explains that they are not included, and he's the one who explains the verses slightly differently. Why? Because we have to say similarly that those things which are prohibited by nevela are also prohibited to be cooked with basar b'chalav. So therefore, the opinion is Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Yossi Glili come to disagree with that first half statement of the Mishnah, which is interesting because we're going to include all of those later on in the final halacha. So are we disagreeing with it in its entirety, or only disagreeing in part? So the Gemara comes to explain some of this. So the Gemara says over here, where do we know all of this from? Starting with the first half of the Mishnah. So the Rabbi Elazar is the first Amor quoted in the Gemara, and he says the following: V'yishlach Yehuda es gedi ha'izim. So Yehuda sends out gedi ha'izim. Okay, so this is referring to by the case of Yehuda and Tamar. So it's referring to the small kid of young goats. Okay. So in this place where it says it's a young kid from goats, so every place where it says a regular gedi, it should even include other types of other things that have calves, basically. Goats, cows, sheep, and all these things should be included. And so therefore, let's try to look at another pasuk which uses the word gedi in a similar context. Now it says that they went ahead and so by the Mishkan, it says they used the gedei ha'izim, they used their skins to make some of the fabrics. Okay, so we say gedei izim is again being explicit about what type of little calves are being used. So that seems to also imply when it just says any type of gedi, it should include those as well. And so therefore, from these two separate cases, They're called Shnei Ksuvim Habaim Ke'echad. Okay, and what does that mean? When you have two verses that say similar things and are explicit in two different places, we don't make any type of general rule from those cases. Okay, so that's fine because we have one opinion who says that we don't. However, there is an opinion who says that we do. So how do we explain to them that this would make sense? So therefore, we're going to learn from the word izim ha-izim. Okay, so a gedi means a little tiny goat or a little tiny thing. Okay, but everything that's going to be older and it's called izim is going to be included with the gedi. So it's not excluding anything. So from these two exclusive cases in the Gemara, what we are seeing is that if we simply state that they are the izim, gedi ha-izim, okay, it means that it's a specific type of young calf, and it has to be explicitly stated that it's one type of young animal. However, when I'm leaving it stam, just by gedi, it's referring to all types of things, okay? It's not referring to one type of specific thing. That's according to the first half of the Mishnah. So the Gemara continues later on. What is the difference between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Akiva? So we quote them separately. Tosfos imply that they seem to be disagreeing on the first statement in the Mishnah. So what is the novelty between the two of them that I have to quote both of them? I could have quoted Rabbi Akiva himself, and Rabbi Yossi could be correct later on to say, "Hey, I agree with Rabbi Akiva." Okay, and then they would be the two opinions against the first opinion. So there is a difference between them, which is specifically the prohibition of the chaya. The Yoreh would say that a chaya is prohibited by Torah law. Rabbi Akiva says no, it's only rabbinic. So since chaya would be included in a prohibition of the vela, right? So you have behema and chaya, and they're included in that. So Rabbi Yossi would say, I get nevela by chaya, so therefore I get basar b'chala by chaya. Okay, Rabbi Akiva would say no, not that way. So another way to learn it is that maybe the kosher birds, are the difference between them. Rabbi Akiva holds that chaya and oaf, okay, they are not prohibited by Torah law. Okay, however, they are rabbinically prohibited, and Rabbi Yossi says that birds are not even prohibited rabbinically at all. Why? Because in Rabbi Yossi town, they used to eat the meat of birds with milk. I used to always joke when learning this Gemara that in Rabbi Yossi town they had chicken parmesan. Okay, so that's the idea. That's how you explain that. So therefore, according to the Tosfos, there are three opinions. Okay, so you have the first group, which is the Tana Kama, the initial Tana in the Mishnah, that all types of meat and milk mixed together when they're kosher, whether they are from a kosher animal, okay, or if they're from a kosher wild animal, or they're from a kosher bird, the Torah has prohibited them to be cooked with milk, and they're all included in basar b'chala. Rabbi Akiva says that the meat of a domesticated animal is going to be included with that, things that are similar to a gedi, as we explained, but things that don't have a gedi with them, like chaya and the oaf, there's only going to be a rabbinic prohibition. And Rabbi Yossi has his own opinion that the meat of a behema and a chaya are prohibited by Torah law because of the nevela extension, but birds are permitted even rabbinically, and so therefore they could mix the two together. So the Rosh explains the halacha is developed in the following way. He quotes the Rif, Rav Alfas, that the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva, and he doesn't bring Rabbi Yossi's opinion at all, because the halacha is finally decided like Rabbi Akiva. Now, if you wanted to say that the rabbis disagree with him, we hold that halacha is Rabbi Akiva against all of his compatriots, also his colleagues, against his colleagues. And this general rule is found in the Seder of Eruvin, in Masechus Eruvin, Mem Vav Mem Beis. Okay, and so that's fine. But he doesn't usually get to get the final decision against everybody. Okay, so really, what it comes down to is that the rabbis essentially could agree with Rabbi Akiva, but the Tana Kama says that it's only going to be including behemoth tahora and not a tameya, right? So only a kosher animal, not a non-kosher animal. And Rabbi Akiva is explaining, why Chaya and Ofer are excluded. So he disagrees with Tosfos a little bit in order to come out with that final halacha. Okay? So then what we have instead is that Rabbi Akiva is what's called a Mefarish. Rabbi Akiva is going to explain the Tanakama. And then Rabbi Yosef Glili is a second opinion. And we explained, just as we said before, that he's prohibiting Behema and Chaya, but the chicken would be completely permitted. Okay? And also the Rambam says a similar thing as well. He actually only quotes Rabbi Akiva. Okay? And he doesn't include anybody, and he doesn't include anybody else. Okay? And so therefore he actually says it slightly differently, where he seems to imply that the opinion of Rabbi Akiva is actually more expansive than the rabbis, and they weren't actually disagreeing with him at all. So what's interesting over here, the Rasha, it brings out an interesting problem over here. He points out that he points out that actually the Tanakam of our Mishnah is not the final halacha anyway, so it disagrees with this Rush. And in going back to explain Tosfos' opinion, that basically there's one opinion who seems to imply that these things are rabbinically prohibited. I mean that they are prohibited by the Torah, and some people seem to say that they are prohibited only rabbinically. Okay, and so it seems to be something where it's like this one says this and that one says that. Okay. And so, therefore, Rabbi Akiva seems to be the one who disagrees with Tanakama, and but it's not necessarily so clear that he is or is not doing that. Okay, so other people seem to also take the approach of Tosfos as well. So you have three approaches over here. You have the Rush, you have the Rush and the Rif, you have the Rambam, and then you have Tosfos with this opinion. So. Here's the issue that comes up if you don't accept the Rush's opinion. Okay, so the reason why this is an issue is because the Gemara says that when it says that in that Mishnah that you're not going to include all types of meat, we're going to learn in that same Mishnah on that same page, on the next page, the Mishnah on a previous page, that we learn that meat is prohibited to cook with milk, okay? But we exclude certain types of meat. We exclude the meat of fish and the meat of locusts, okay, which we point out in the Halacha earlier. And you also aren't allowed to serve meat on the same table as cheese, okay? However, you could do that with fish and with locusts. And also, the Mishnah further says that someone who takes a vow not to consume meat is allowed to eat the meat of fish and of locusts. So the Gemara discusses further this issue of what is not called meat. So the Gemara asks, this is on Kuf Daled, that it seems to imply that chicken meat should be prohibited by Torah law. Why does it only say that we're excluding the meat of fish and of locusts? So the Tana, this Mishnah, seems to hold that chicken meat or bird meat, that's kosher birds, are prohibited by Torah law. And the Gemara responds, that doesn't agree with Rabbi Akiva's opinion, because Rabbi Akiva says that the oath is not from the Torah, okay? And so therefore it says, well, that's because they disagree. And then the Gemara goes on and continues. There's also the first Tana is just Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and he says that according to Rebbe, he wants us to make the halacha like Rabbi Akiva because he holds like him in another Masechta, which is only about vows, but he wanted to point it out here that the halacha should be like Rabbi Akiva in that case. However, when it comes to Basar Chalav, most rabbis disagree with Rabbi Akiva. We don't want to mix up the two. We don't want people to think the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva. Then Rav Ashi says, no. Rabbi Kiva taught this whole Mishnah, and what it's saying is that all meat is prohibited to cook with milk, whether they are Torah prohibition or rabbinic prohibition, except for those two which don't even have a rabbinic prohibition. Okay, so it seems like Rabbi Asi would kind of help us out over here. Okay, so Rashi explains that even though the Torah has said the word gedi, which we just learned means little small domesticated animals, it's also referring to chaya and oaf, right, the non-domesticated animals, and to birds. And this issue is discussed in another Gemara. And so this previous Gemara is trying to differentiate between our Mishnah and the later Mishnah in terms of those two cases. So based on this statement, this last statement over here, there is a machlokes between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Kiva over here, which is not how we learn the Rush. So that's how do they come out to say that this is not the proper way? Okay. So here's the answer. The Rush holds like Rav Ashi. Okay. So Rav Ashi over here is Rabbi Kiva. All right. So even though he doesn't say that, he was only trying to answer for the sugya later on. That seems to imply there are several different opinions in there. But really, everything here comes from Rabbi Kiva. Okay? And so therefore, this is why he decides to follow the opinion of the Rif. That's like Rabbi Kiva. And therefore, the halacha is like Rav Ashi, as I just quoted here, and like Rabbi Kiva in the Mishnah quoted earlier. Okay? And that would make sense. That would make sense to establish all of them, and even to include the first opinion of the Mishnah later on, which would be the Rabbanan, which would be everybody else, because they were the majority opinion. Okay, so that is the way to explain that. Now, let's take a look at this Machlokes Rishonim a little bit more in depth over here. How the Mechaber and the Ramah decided. So Tosfos seems to imply that the halacha is like the Tanna Kama, okay, which was the one who held that it's only non-kosher animals that are prohibited, and not including an exemption for chaya and oaf, okay. And we don't see them hold that way, but a number of people seem to hold that way, okay. And that's also the opinion of the Bach, the Marshal, the Sharei Dura. Okay, there's a lot of people that are Chaim. Fine. Now the Rambam, okay, that we mentioned earlier just briefly, that he says that by Basar Chaya and Oaf, okay, when they are mixed with milk from Chaya or the milk from Behema, their prohibition is only rabbinic, and therefore it's permitted to cook them, and it's not permitted to eat them. But that prohibition is only rabbinic. Okay? And so he seems to take the approach of Rebbe Kiva. But those approaches are also the one of the Rif and the Rush, even though they're slightly different in their language, because the Rush and the Rif seem to imply that Rebbe Kiva is the Tanna Kama. The main thrust of it seems to be, however you want to learn out the sugya, the halacha is going to follow Rebbe Akiva, which is different than the way Tosos is learning it. Okay? So that's the main thing. Okay? Now, and definitely no one holds like Rabbi Yossi. Just completely. That's the main thing. So the Mechaber, in his language, where he says that Gedi lav davka, okay, that Gedi doesn't mean one type of animal. It also includes other types of animals. Okay? So he said he's saying that he's saying like the Rush, the Rif, and the Rambam, and the Ramah follows that as well. Okay, so that's how they hold. Okay, and so therefore, when it comes to wild animals like deer and kosher birds, so what's the ruling by Bishul and Hana? Okay, so the answer is that they are only prohibited rabbinically. Okay, so that is how the main poskim here that we were quoting imply the final halacha. Okay, so that's the main thrust of their opinion, and that's how the Mechaber and the Ramah come out to their decision. And so, based on what the Mishna is the Mishnah's explanation, we are going to say that Rabbi Kiva is teaching us the whole Mishnah, except for the opinion of Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, which is because they don't essentially agree on that last fact. Okay. Now, there's another interesting thing over here, is that a number of Achronim say that maybe we should be concerned for the opinion of Tosfos that say that Chai and Ofer are Torah prohibition. Okay, so the Marshal is one of the proponents of this, that even if we don't want to say that there's a Torah prohibition, at the very least we should still prohibit it and rule against the Mechaber, because we have the opinion of Tosfos. So the Shach here, this is in Sif Katan Daled, says that the Marshal is a reasonable approach, but he doesn't make sense to say it should only be rabbinically prohibited, because really he's saying we should be concerned for it because some people hold it's an Isser Torah. So he's arguing at the very least we should have a rabbinic prohibition. And the Aruch HaShulchan also quotes a number of people as well who seem to be concerned for this. Okay? And also amongst the Sephardi poskim, there's the Ben Ish Chai, who prohibit it, that you would be meritorious to follow this opinion. Okay? Therefore you shouldn't cook it, but if it was cooked already, one could rely on the lenient opinions. Okay? And the Darchei Moshe brought all of these opinions down, and he says basically that the many opinions were not, the consensus of opinion was not to be strict on this. That's how the Ramah brought down in his Darchei Moshe. And even after him, the Levush, the student of the Ramah, Rav Mordechai, right? He says that you shouldn't be stringent, but that if you want to, there be blessings for you to follow this opinion. So he says, however, that that's only by chaya, and says that by oaf, by birds, he seems to disagree and take a lenient stance on birds altogether. So he has an interesting opinion on that. And so, therefore, it seems like maybe you just have to be a little bit stringent by a chaya, but it's tough to understand. Okay. However, even later authorities, especially Sephardic authorities of the Kaf HaChaim, the Zivchei Tzedek, seem to imply that the Aruch HaShulchan that says he should be stringent, and the Ben Ish Chai and so on, they seem to imply that there's no reason to be stringent like this, and therefore they disagree. Okay? So again, this is because you can tell that you're cooking it with venison, that you're cooking it with chicken, that you're cooking it with things that are recognizably chicken and so on. Okay? So how can we understand all of this in the light of the halacha? Okay, in terms of what our actual practice is. So can we go ahead and follow the Shulchan Aruch's opinion and the Ramah's opinion to follow the simple language of the Mishnah that seems to imply that it might actually be permitted? Okay, so let's go back to our Mishnah again. That says that the only thing that's prohibited to cook is kosher meat and kosher milk, but it's not prohibited for fish and chagavim. Okay, and you also can't put them in the same thing together. So we established that the whole Mishnah is the language of Rabbi Akiva. Okay, and so therefore certain things are excluded. Now, the Maggid Mishnah asks this question when he looks at the Rambam's opinion, who says that this is all Rabbi Akiva. So it seems like it should be okay to go ahead and cook the meat of birds with milk. Okay, well, that doesn't seem to be the simple language of it. So why does the Rambam seem to bring it that way? Okay, and why does he seem to accept that? So the Maggid Mishna says that the main thing was that it was the question was, were you cooking to eat it or were you cooking to do something else with it? Okay, so that is his distinction between the two different statements in the Mishnah. So it seems like it's an extension of Mars Ayin. So that is the statement of the Maggid Mishnah on the Rambam in explaining when you take the whole thing as the statement of Rabbi Akiva, when we're going to permit chaya and oaf for cooking, we were talking about cooking it when you're not cooking it for the purposes of eating it yourself, but maybe cooking it for another reason, maybe feed it to other animals. Okay. And so a number of Achronim discuss this inside of the Gemara itself. So they point out later on in the Gemara that it says that you can't eat these certain things, right? And they go through the Gemara and they say there's a number of times where we say you can't eat certain prohibited things, you can't eat certain permitted things. And so the question is, when we go through the Gemara several times, it has a number of different of statements about what is the reasoning for understanding bishul and achila as meaning the same thing. That when you cook, you shouldn't eat. So what they're trying to say is that amongst these different opinions that try to explain cooking, eating in the same types of fashions as is a fashion of consumption, meaning cooking to eat is a way in which one engages in consumption. And so it's entirely possible that the cooking done for that is what the rabbis were trying to restrict, but not necessarily if it was being cooked to prepare it for another usage pattern. Okay? And so, therefore, a number of people say that, based on the simple understanding of the Gemara, that the statement of calling it gedi, and therefore prohibiting it for cooking, it screams out drasha. Like it's not meant to be a literal and exceptional thing. Okay, and so therefore that's why all the Tanaim eventually come out in the later Mishnah and say it's excluding other things. The gedi isn't specific enough, but it's not particular enough. So it's telling you that it's trying to be in both directions. Okay? And so according to the Rebbe Kiva and the Tanakama, it's not like it's impossible to have one without the other. And that really seems to be the main thing, but what seems to be getting across is whether or not this prohibition of benefit should extend to anything and everything. Okay? And so, therefore, we don't really want to spend a whole lot of time here going into the real difficulties on the Gemara, but it's essential to kind of understand that it wasn't so simple how the Shulchan Aruch came out to this understanding that all these types of different categories would be excluded from the prohibition of cooking and hana. So meaning excluding non-kosher meat, excluding non-kosher milk, excluding deer, excluding kosher birds. So those things seem to have been made exceptional based on the fact that the language itself was only partially specific and almost in itself demanding to be explained in a very, very narrow, while also giving it some significant exceptions. So the Tur himself, when he brings the language of the Shulchan Aruch is really the language of the Tur. So he says, it's really interesting. It says, he seems to be quoting directly from the Mishnah, right? It seems like the Tur is quoting directly from the Mishnah. He says that it's only applicable by kosher animals and not by non-kosher animals, okay? And not by non-kosher milk. So Beis Yosef says, I don't understand something. So he says the Mishnah itself, okay, was also trying to exclude other things as well. So even though those things are rabbinic prohibitions, they really shouldn't be considered as equivalent linguistically. You shouldn't equivocate them in our legal text. And therefore, the best way to explain it is really to explain it like the Rambam explains it. So, which is to say that you need to break up the two categories, as some are excluded from this because there's a separate prohibition attached to them that does not include them in the prohibition of Basar Chalav, like when non-kosher objects are being used. And some of them are really coming to tell you that when these things are permitted, they are excluded, but they are excluded because they're not considered part of the category in which the word gedi functions. And in those two cases, they are exclusive, and not for the same reason. So they're not included, but not for the same reason. Okay, so even though if you drew a Venn diagram, they're not included, but they shouldn't be in that same bubble. There should be, here's Basar Chalav, here's things excluded because they are not kosher, and here's things excluded because they are not in the category of gedi. And they are similar, but yet exclusive from each other, and just excluded from the category of Basar Chalav. And so he says that that's really why you have to explicitly separate them in the language. Okay. However, the Bach says no. He wants to be stringent like the Tosfos, and he also quotes the Rabbeinu Ephraim. It says that the reason what the Mishna actually was excluding was, as we learned in the previous halacha, was to exclude it from a category of chaticha, nasas, and nevela. Right? The whole thing doesn't become prohibited, and if you cut it up and put in different things, those rules don't apply. Okay, so he makes a separate extension for that. But other Achronim disagree with him, like Taz disagrees with him, and doesn't extend it to that. And the Shach also says, nope, I don't disagree. This is a big novel idea which is not found in any other posek anywhere in the whole world, not amongst Rishonim, not amongst anybody else. And so therefore the prohibition of Basar Chalav doesn't extend to these cases as mentioned here, even rabbinically, other than the prohibition of consumption. Okay, and that's why the Beis Yosef is so explicit in saying that there has to be separate categories to show that the drushes were applied separately, whereas the Torah wasn't so clear about that in his language. And a more recent Achron, the Madnei HaShulchan, who lived in the 1980s and 1990s, he actually writes a really interesting chiddush over here. He says that it's really interesting. I have to say something that will help this, but it's not compelling in the language, but I think it will help our understanding of it. Is that the Torah himself is just trying to say that there's a category of Torah prohibited and rabbinically prohibited, and that's all he's trying to get at. And that's why it makes the language so simple, which is to say, basically, my goal here is to delineate those categories of meat, which are those of Torah prohibited ones, which are things that come from cows, from lambs and sheep and goats. Those categories, those get that. Everything else, there's going to be rabbinic attachments to them. Like if if you're cooking something with something not included in those categories. There's some rabbinic stuff, right? Like, so if something is not kosher, I don't need a rabbinic prohibition, because there's already a Torah prohibition attached to it. But what about, the chaya and the oaf and those things? Well, there's rabbinic prohibitions attached to that. So there's something else, but the main thing is to understand that there's certain categories where the Torah prohibition applies and certain categories where the rabbinic prohibition applies. Okay? And he also says that there's some interesting other things over here to point out as well, which is that we're also trying to lead up into the statements of things that are prohibited because of Maris Ayin. So there is a reason to prohibit them, and therefore they're still in a prohibited category, and they're not free and clear because we want to say that they are restricted by Maris Ayin, which we'll get to later about what falls in that category. But in the meantime, we're simply just trying to establish that these types of meat are the prohibited ones, and things not in this category are going to get a separate category which we're not applying as yet. But just know that they are excluded from the Torah's prohibition category. Okay, and these are all the words of the Madnei HaShulchan. Rabinowitz Zatzal was a big Talmud Chacham. He lived in Eretz Yisrael. He wrote fabulous work, Madnei HaShulchan. And so I'm zeicha to read some of his words here for you tonight, making some notes on them. Okay. So other things that might imply was also if you could consume them in abnormal ways, like if they were mixed into medicines, right? If you had something where they were mixed into some type of medication, these wouldn't apply the strict prohibitions we had mentioned earlier. Okay. So let's just summarize this whole thing and take a look at what the final halacha is. Okay, so the Mishna in Chulin tells us which types of meat are meant to be prohibited by Basar b'chalav in the Torah category. There is a machlokes as to what is included in those categories. There's a machlokes between two other Tanaim, that's Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi Glili, and there's a machlokes Rishayim. Okay? So, according to Tosfos, there are three shitos in the Mishnah. So you have the Tanakama, which is the Rabbanan, that they are including categories of meat from cattle, meat from wild animals like deer, and meat from kosher birds. Okay? And that's the Asur Min Torah category. Okay? Torah prohibition. Rabbi Akiva is limiting that category, and he's saying that it's only behema, it's only cattle or sheep or goats, but the other two categories, chaya and oaf, are a rabbinic category. And Rabbi Yossi Glili chops off birds. Okay, so that's the opinion of Tosfos. We do not end up passing like Tosfos. Now, the Rush also brings the three opinions. He wraps the Tanakama and Rabbi Akiva together, okay, and says they are one and the same. And then Rabbi Yossi Glili is coming to exclude birds. Okay, this is also the opinion of the Rambam, and he just focuses a little more heavily on the wording of Rabbi Akiva. And so he's written slightly differently, but he's essentially agreeing to it. And that's also the opinion of the Rashba as well. They just make a little bit of a difference of opinion between them. So, the final halacha is, there are people who are machmir to follow the opinion of Tosfos, which is the Marshal, the Bach, and the Orach Chaim. We quoted them earlier. The Marshal was the big one. Okay? And the other Rishonim are followed by the Mechaber and the Ramah, okay, and so that's what we follow, which is basically that Chaya and Oaf are only rabbinically prohibited, and so therefore we see that there is a machlokes that comes down to us, which is that so the Mechaber, the Ramah, and so on say that cooking deer or birds in milk is only a rabbinic prohibition, whereas this Bach and the Isser V'Heter, they say that you should be worried about that. So the Marshal comes up with a middle opinion, which is to basically say that it should be a rabbinic prohibition on doing that. And the Shach says that this is being concerned for the opinion of Tosfos, and the Marshal says this. So the Shach echoes the Marshal, and we also have the Erech HaShulchan, and we also quoted the Ben Ish Chai. There's a few people who held this opinion. Okay. However, we don't hold other people who disagree with this. Okay, who disagree with this opinion, even though it's always fine to be strict. Another thing over here. So let's see. So okay, there's nobody who has any problem with fish or with locusts. Okay, and the Mechaber and the Rambam add that, and other things to say. So is to add. So for example, if you have sheep meat, okay, and you have cow milk, or you have cow meat and sheep's milk, or goat's milk and sheep meat, these are all prohibited from cooking. So those are all in the category. Okay? Thank you for listening for tonight's shir. Look forward to discussing more about these three halachos with you next time, where we talk about more about behemoth tameya and what that includes, which will be the prohibition of nevela and treifa and chalev. These things that are considered that have their own separate prohibition to them. How does that play out in halacha l'maisa? Thank you for tonight's class, and we'll talk to you soon.